schools across Britain will close by the end of the week until further notice as the death toll
campus are being asked to pack up their things and leave until further notice.
This morning, millions of students across the country are sitting at home, with more than
schools are also
55,000
temporarily
schools
closing in some districts across the country.
Schools will close their doors by Friday. From next week, most children will be at home.
Schools are
until
suspending or even canceling in-person classes, opting instead to teach remotely.
Now, as many of you probably already know, the school year has come to an end. This very, very interesting, very, very unique 2020-2021 school year has come to a conclusive end, and it has been a roller coaster ride, to say the least. And today in this video, I'm just going to basically lay out my own experience from this year and maybe give my thoughts on it or something like that, because I think it'd be pretty interesting. I don't know. But if you do not know, which, to be fair, I don't think I've hardly mentioned it on this channel, I still go to school. I am still a student. I still go to school. And if you didn't already know specifically, I recently finished up my junior year of high school. So my 2020-2021 school year was in fact my junior year of high school. And today I'm just going to be sharing my entire experience through this roller coaster of a year, because it is quite an interesting one. Now, this video is going to be structured a little weirdly, to say the least. So basically, I'm just going to be kind of going over, as you can, see on screen, obviously, I'm going to go over how it was before the school year actually begun, how the school year was throughout the year, changes along the way, and then I decided to have band as its own kind of separate thing. Because if you don't know, I'm in band. I love band. Band is great. Band is pretty great. If you're not in band, you should do band, because band is cool. But aside that out of the way, band has been an entire roller coaster ride, from marching season to concert season. It's just been a roller coaster ride. And then at the end, conclusion and all that kind of stuff. So let's just go ahead and get into how the school year was properly before it, really begun. So when the school year was first beginning, quote unquote, it wasn't really beginning, but the months prior to, essentially, the weeks prior, should I say. But before then, there was a lot of uncertainty. Most people didn't know how it was going to go. Most people were still like, what's going on? Are we going to have to go to school and that kind of thing? And there was just a lot of unknown, to say the least. Now, what they did announce, the school district that I go to and that kind of thing, they gave us the option between going to school in person, meaning, in person, you actually went to the school, did classes semi-normally. It was basically like a normal school year, to say the least. And then you had the option of being online, which means, and there was kind of two options for being online. You could be online and you would go to Google Meets or whatever. You would go to the Google Meets for the class period at that time, and you would log in and you would do all the stuff online and that kind of thing. And then there was this weird other group. It was like the completely remote group is what it was known as. And this group essentially would do everything offline, essentially, or online. It's kind of a weird thing. They basically did it. They had no interaction with what was going on in the school aside from the work that they were given. So they didn't go to the Google Meets. They didn't go in person. They essentially did everything on their own time, kind of. It's kind of like homeschool, but I'm not sure. I never really did it. So yeah, those are technically the two, kind of three options for how school was going to be. And after spending so long being locked up, I, like a lot of other people, chose to go in person. So that's what I did, and I was actually really looking forward to it. I was going to go back. I was going to see people that I hadn't seen in such a long time, and I was really looking forward to it. So I was pretty excited, to say the least, to go back to school. And so we get to the part where the school year actually begun. So yeah, it was very different. That kind of goes without saying, but it was very different. So first things first, there was not too many people, to say the least. Now, let's give a rough estimate, because I don't know exactly how many people total were in the school and how many people actually were in person. But let's say my school consisted of 100 people. It's a lot bigger than that, but relatively speaking, let's say it consisted of 100 people. Out of those 100 people, about maybe 52 people went to in-person, and then everybody else went online. So that's how it started. Keep that in mind for a later date. So inside, like the actual environment of the school. So obviously, you know, there was a lot fewer people, meaning that halls were less crowded and that kind of thing. And speaking of the halls, there was something that they did, you know, part of many regulations and that kind of thing put in place. We had arrows, essentially. So normally throughout the school, you essentially had free roam. You can go anywhere, you know. It was basically like highways. The halls were basically highways. You would go on the right side of the hallway, you know, and then you would go back. It was like a road, essentially. You would go on the right and the other people would go on the left and that kind of thing. It was basically free roam. That's how it's always been, and I assume that's how it is for most people. However, what they did for this year is that they had arrows, essentially. So if you wanted to get somewhere, you had to follow the arrows that they had with like little scotch tape or whatever on the ground or whatever, and they would tell you where to go, and you essentially had to follow those arrows. Now, obviously, you know, not everybody did, but throughout the beginning of the year, it was pretty enforced, to say the least, that, you know, everybody had to go through arrows and that kind of thing. And as a result of these arrows basically like telling you where you had to go, because the arrows, they were not like how the quote-unquote like highway hallways were working essentially before. All the hallways were one way, essentially. Well, there was very few exceptions to where they were both ways, but every single hallway was a one-way street, essentially. Like the arrows would go one way and you could only go that way. And as a result of that, being that sometimes you had to walk completely around like the school in some cases, they had to extend the passing periods, which is, you know, as the name would imply, the period between one period and the other period. You know, they had to extend it because otherwise you would have to essentially be sprinting, and that's pretty good. That's pretty good that they did extend it, because boy, oh boy, sometimes the weird arrow things would take a long time to get through. And now let's go on to arguably one of the more prominent things about this year, masks. Yes, obviously, like everywhere else in the world, there was masks. And I mean, it didn't specifically have to be masks. I don't know if it specifically had to be something that covered your face. Like, I think some people got away with just a face shield, but all in all, if you wore something, I think you were good. So yeah, masks were a thing, and it was something you had to do for at least the in-person people, obviously, but for online, obviously not, because they're at home. And then to go along with the general protocols, if you will, for the whole situation, there was also like the spacing thing. Now, spacing wasn't too much of a thing it was not something that was made such a big deal. There was separation during lunches. So during lunches, they had this spacing and that kind of thing. Like, you had to sit, you know, a certain distance from each other. But in most cases, you weren't really spaced out. Like, at the probably the only day that I think they really, like, teachers and going through the hallways and that kind of thing, I think the only day that they really cared about spacing was like the first week, essentially. But after that, it kind of got like most people started getting a lot more closer to each other and that kind of thing. And, you know, it was fine. It was fine. It wasn't too terrible. But yeah, now I should probably get into the part where how the actual experience was. So as I said before, I was somebody that chose to go to school in person. I was in person the entire year. I mean, there was like maybe 1 or 2 days that I didn't go because of appointments that got in the way, or just like this one day I had a migraine or some kind of headache or something like that. But point being, I spent a majority of the year, like 99.9% of the year, in person, and because of that, I got to pretty much get a first-hand experience of how the whole ordeal went. So throughout the course of the year, people that were initially online were given the option to switch. Now, at the beginning of the year, like I said, you were given the choice between in-person and online. However, as the year went on, like I think at the end of the first semester or something like that, you were given the option, if you were online, to go in person. But that's how it was for online. For in-person people, you could go online at any time. So if you woke up in the morning and you decided, you know what, I don't want to go to school anymore, I want to be an online person, you could do that. You could do it at a moment's notice, essentially. But if you were an online person, you pretty much had to wait till the end of the semester or grading period or something like that. I'm not exactly too sure when it was exactly, but you were given the option to go from online to in-person a lot more further back. You couldn't do it at a moment's notice like the in-person to online people. But if you were an in-person person, you did have the option to essentially go online for a day. Like I said before, some days I didn't go to school. I could pretty much just go online and then I'd pretty much be good for the entire day. So that was something, I guess that was a kind of advantage, to say the least. Most of the teachers didn't like it, and I can kind of see why, because, I mean, it made them have to do a little bit more work and that kind of thing, because it kind of messed with everything. But point being, it was a lot easier, I guess, being an in-person person rather than being an online person. And because of this weird dynamic in terms of online and in-person, and the fact that, you know, we didn't want to spread anything, there was hardly any paperwork. Now, I don't want to say there was no paperwork, to say the least, as in, like, you would get pieces of paper and that would be your homework and your notes or whatever. It wasn't completely void of that. Like, as the year went on, as I said, a lot of things got a little bit more lenient, but I'll go that in the changes along the way section of this video. But point being, there was a lot of downscaling, to say the least, in terms of the work. A lot of the work went online. A lot of the work was a little bit more minimized. Like, say, for example, like in science classes, I took physics, and there was there was hardly any labs. You know, there was hardly any labs because we weren't really able to do that this year, especially because of the online people. So there wasn't any labs in, like, you know, science classes. I'd imagine that's how it was for most people. And there was just, as I said before, there was just a lot of downscaling in terms of work, a lot less paperwork, to say the least. And then I think to wrap up this section, I want to go over the whole testing part of the year. So keep in mind that this testing part of the year is during the later part of the year. You know, this is where AP exams come into play. I live in the state of Texas, so we had to take STAR tests still. And it's essentially just like a standardized test. That's basically what STAR is if you don't live in the state of Texas. But basically during the testing period, it was done very interesting, to say the least. So I've obviously taken STAR before, but I have never taken a normal AP test, to say the least. So in freshman year of high school, you were not really able to take any AP courses. So I didn't take any courses that year. Now, last year, in my sophomore year of high school, I did take AP tests, but as most of you know who did take AP classes, it was interesting. You know, it was online. It was something that was completely not normal. And it was, you know, as I said, just not normal. It was not normal. And then this year we had AP tests, and they were done, at least what I would imagine, fairly normally. Like, there was some distancing, to say the least, like social distancing, that kind of thing. But relatively speaking, AP tests and all that kind of other stuff, it was pretty normal, to say the least. At least from my own experience, it seemed normal. You know, you'd have like your multiple choice, your free response, that kind of thing. You know, you just basically do the AP test, to say the least. And it was pretty normal, all things considered. But that was probably because at that point it was like May and things were a lot more lenient and it wasn't as scary. We knew a lot more about what was going on and that kind of thing. So that definitely had something to contribute to it. And all right, so let's go on with the changes along the way. So with this ever-changing school year, I want to go over essentially what did change over the course of the year. So I kind of laid out like the grounds over to how things were, or how things started out as. So like, you know, arrows and all that kind of thing. And here are some changes that were made along the way. Now, obviously, this is from my own experience. This is from things that happened in my state and how things were in my own district. So obviously, some things might not be as, they might be different from what other people might have experienced, but this is just my own story. So essentially, as I said before, I live in the state of Texas. Now, most of you probably already know the mask mandate was removed in like March or February. I can't really remember. Maybe it was April. It was somewhere around that time during this year. And as a follow-up, that kind of translated into how the school year went. So before then, the school was essentially like required. Like, you essentially had to wear a mask or something of that nature, something that covered your face. However, when the mask mandate was essentially lifted, then you could roam around without having a mask. You could go completely normal as if nothing had ever done. And a lot of people did take advantage of that. So, I mean, that was pretty interesting. That did change throughout the course of the year. It wasn't too, like, controversial, to say the least. It wasn't too big, at least in terms of, like, the school or whatever. Most people, if anything, were kind of excited about it because it'd be a lot more normal. But to say the least, it wasn't all that bad. It wasn't all that bad. And as I've mentioned previously a little bit, the rules essentially got a lot more lenient. Now, like as I said in the beginning, this is how things were. You know, they said you had to do this and this and this and this. But as the year continued on, a lot of that got a lot more lenient. Now, like throughout like May, sometime in May, they got rid of the arrows, essentially. So everything was completely normal. You can go whichever way you wanted to, and they just got rid of arrows, essentially. And just the rules, essentially, were a lot more lenient. So, as I said before, the mask mandate was lifted, the arrows were removed. Distancing became a lot more of like, most people didn't really do it, to say the least. Like in lunch, a lot of people started sitting next to each other again, like directly next to each other and a lot more closer. And it kind of followed suit. Like most of the people, like, you know what I mean? Like the admins, essentially, they didn't really like enforce everything that was established at the beginning of the year because of how the situation is going, you know, with like vaccines and all that kind of stuff. A lot of things became a lot more lenient. So that was something that was pretty interesting that went on the course of this year. And that brings me to band. So I decided to put band in its own separate kind of entity because it was an entire ordeal in and of itself. So at the beginning of the year, now if you don't do band, essentially we have what's known as band camps. So for the entire month of August, essentially, you would go to school, or you wouldn't go to school, but you would essentially go to school and you would do marching band stuff. So you would learn how to march, learn the show, learn the music, all that kind of stuff. So that's basically how it was in a normal year. Now, what we did in band was something very different. So as I said before, there was a lot of unknown, to say the least. Most people didn't really know what was going to go on. And because of the fact that the year got cut short, a lot of things that would be done normally, like physicals and the paperwork and all that kind of stuff that would happen at the end of the year from the 2019-2020 school year, that was all essentially removed because of how the year went. It was cut abruptly, and that's pretty much how it was. So it was a lot of interesting moving parts to make this thing go together. So at the beginning of the year, you know, in order to participate in marching band and all that kind of stuff, you need things like physical and medical records and all this other stuff that essentially allows you to participate in physical activities like most other sports, like football and soccer and all that kind of stuff, and band's not really an exception to that. So what they had to do is they made us download this app. I don't really remember exactly what this app was. I'll probably put it up on screen if I can remember or find what app it was. But essentially, you would use this app, and it allowed you to submit all the paperwork that you needed to do in order to essentially participate. So once that was all taken care of, there was this like survey or screener that you had to do at the beginning of every day of band camp. And that's something I had to do. Now, as I said before, band camp normally would be the entire month of August, 5 days a week, and you would go how we usually do it. It's like 7 or 8 a.m. all the way to 5 p.m. or something like that. It's a pretty long time. However, this year was very interesting. In order to follow like regulations and protocols that were set on at the time, band was very broken, to say the least. It was a complete shell of its former self. And how it was, essentially, the band as a whole was cut in half, and it was made into 2 different teams, and these 2 different teams would go on separate days. So let's say you have Team 1 and Team 2, and Team 1 would go to band camp for only like 4 hours or 3 hours a day. It was like maybe 8 to 11 or something like that. It was not at all a long time. And all it was essentially marching basics. There was no music at all whatsoever. There was no like music practicing for the show. And like the show itself was completely it was completely out of the question. Nobody really knew how the show was going to go because we didn't really have a show. We had a show, or I'd imagine we might have had a show, but that was essentially scrapped, to say the least. So essentially how it worked, Team 1 would go to band camp on Monday and Wednesday, for example, and then Team 2 would go to band camp on Tuesday and Thursdays, and then Fridays would be off. And that was it. There was hardly any band camp, to say the least. And because of that, there was a lot less of what would normally be done. But to be fair, there wasn't really much of a season this year because of how everything was going on. So how it was is that the directors, they wanted to make the year as normal as possible. They wanted it to be fun. And in all respects, I think they did a pretty good job of doing that. So as I mentioned before, band camp was very weird, but then the school year started to roll around. So now every day after school, you'd have marching band practice. Now, I can't exactly remember, but I'm pretty sure that the team aspect going once every other day did carry on at the very beginning of the year. But then as the year continued on, that definitely got scrapped essentially. So what would normally happen on a normal year is that, you'd have football games throughout the course of the year, like every Friday. Now, what would normally normally be done is that the first football game would be on the first week of school, on that Friday. But I don't exactly remember when the first football game was, but it was definitely not that. And as a result, we didn't really know what was going to be done. So on the first football game, now to mention, bands usually, if you have ever been to like a high school football game or any kind of football game for that matter, you would know that the band of said school does travel with them. However, that's not the case, or that was not the case this year. Normally we would go everywhere with them. However, we were only limited to the home games, which means that we were essentially, like, the amount of football games that we went to this year was cut in half, and that was pretty sad to say the least. But regardless though, the first football game that we went to, the first home game essentially, was done with the two-team aspect. So Team 1, essentially, for example, Team 1 went to that football game, while Team 2 didn't really go to anything. Now, unfortunately, I was part of this supposed Team 2 or whatever, so I've had one less football game than half of the other band members, so I guess that's kind of sad. But point being, following that game, things changed from band. After that, things changed drastically for band. Band was now able to meet as a whole again. So now there wasn't the two-team weirdness and having to know of, oh, this team did this, but this other team did that, and that kind of thing. Now we were all together again, so that was pretty good. I believe this was sometime in like maybe mid-September or something like that, although I can't remember off the top of my head. But point being, we were put together again, and that was pretty great to say the least. And it was around this time where band actually started to feeling a lot more normal, to say the least. So what would normally happen throughout the band season is that there would be like competitions and contests and that kind of thing, and you can notice a trend here. All of that was essentially taken down, but regardless of that, we still had a show in the works. So the show this year was something that was, I wouldn't say, it was like roughly put together, to say the least. It was something, so we would still have a show, something to be proud of, something to work towards, and something that we could look back on and, you know, essentially be proud of. Now, this show was definitely something that was abnormal, to say the least. Now, normally most marching shows, or at least high school marching shows, are around 7 to 8 minutes long. This show was like 3 to 4. It was essentially cut in half, like most everything that happened this year. But regardless though, we still did have a show, and that was something I was very proud of. So this also happened, like I said, when the band became back together again, although a little bit later. This was maybe like, I don't know, maybe late September, something like that. So we essentially got a show and we started working on it. We got music, and it was pretty exciting, to say the least. We had a show, and pretty much that was the summary of the year. Now, a little bit later, around like November, maybe it was October, something like that, we got word that because there was no anything, there would be no kind of contest or anything like that. We received word that, okay, since we're not going to do anything like this, we still want to give everybody that is in the band inside our district a chance to display their own show and that kind of thing. So that's essentially what was organized. So it was like a showcase, essentially. It wasn't a contest. There was no trophies. There was no judges. There was no anything like that. It was essentially a way for the bands of our district to display their shows, or what they had put together over the course of this year. And that was really exciting because it gave us something to actually look forward to. You know, it felt like a contest, and once the day came, it was really fun, to say the least. And afterwards, like the 5 or so bands within the district, we all like collaboratively played like Don't Stop Believing, and it was pretty interesting, to say the least. It was very fun. It was very fun, to say the least, and I'm very happy about that. And then fast forward to a little bit later, around like late November, early December, something like that, football finally reaches its end, or at least reaches its end to a normal season, and then playoffs arrive. Now, playoffs come, and then the first game of the playoffs was an away game. Now, luckily, out of the blue, we were given the option to travel there, and it was something that was very exciting, to say the least. This was a moment where everybody was like, oh my goodness, yes, finally, we're finally getting to do something exciting for once. I mean, we had been going to the home games, but now we were allowed to go to the away games, and that was something that was really exciting. So we went to that away game. It was very fun. We managed to win that game, and then we had another game following that one, as you know, football does. But however, this was also in another away game, and unfortunately, this district that we are going to did not allow us to travel there. So that was pretty much the end of our marching band career, as that was really the only contest, the showcase that I mentioned before. And after that, marching season finally came to a close, and that leads us in December. So here we are in December, and marching season is officially over with, and it's time to start up concert season. So concert season, how it normally be done is, you would have concerts, and essentially you would do them in the auditorium. However, seeing that our band is so big now, like most other people, I don't know if this is a common thing for most other groups or whatever, but there's different bands to say the least. Now for us specifically, we have 4 different groups, and this was big. Now some groups were very big, some were bigger than others, and unfortunately because of that and the distancing thing that they wanted to maintain, we essentially were not able to be in the auditorium, as essentially we were too big. We couldn't fit within the auditorium stage, so we had to go to the gym, and that is how the Christmas concert went. But aside from that, after that, we were allowed to essentially go back to the normal auditorium stage. As as I said before, there was a lot more lenient restrictions and that kind of thing, so we were allowed to be put more closer together, allowing us to fit on the auditorium. And then after that, essentially everything was pretty normal. There was normal, like what's known as UIL, essentially. That's the goal, essentially. That's the peak goal of concert season. Aside from, obviously, concerts. Aside from the concerts, the end goal is essentially UIL. And UIL was pretty normal, to say the least. So that was pretty exciting. And with that, band did indeed come to a close, as the entire school year came to a close. And overall, I think band was very weird. It was very weird, but it was pretty fun, to say the least. Very, very fun. And so that brings us to today. I hope I've mentioned everything that happened over the course of this year, and I hope you were able to maybe learn something and take into consideration somebody else's point of view of how this whole school year went. So that was pretty much everything that happened over the course of this year. I feel like I might have missed some things, but hopefully I did go everything that I at least wanted to. So yeah, this is a pretty long video. I hope you enjoyed it, because wow, this turned out to be a lot more of a longer video than I initially thought. But I don't know, it might have been a weird, interesting story time commentary video kind of thing. But above all, I think this year was very interesting. However, that doesn't say that this year was necessarily bad. Overall, I think this year was very fun. It definitely is a year to look back on and remember, and I guess essentially laugh at, because like, wow, this was a pretty interesting year, to say the least. But regardless, though, that has been my entire school year experience. So I hope you guys did enjoy it. I hope you guys didn't get too bored over me talking for, I don't know, like half an hour or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. But regardless, though, if you did enjoy it, then please feel free to subscribe. So yeah, with all that out of the way, I want to thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Peace. Bye.